Feedback is simply a special case of the communication process by which an individual receives information about him or herself. Now, it's important to note that the function or the purpose of feedback is twofold. One, to instruct, which actually affects efficacy, but the second one, to motivate, which affects the instrumentality or the certainty that the person will receive the outcome given the effort. Let's look first at the classic feedback model and then see how this applies to leadership. First of all, there is a recipient of the feedback, and there to the recipient comes a message, and it comes from a source. Now, the message has several characteristics that are important in terms of how the recipient will receive and process the feedback. The first is timing. It is critical that feedback be given as soon as possible following the behavior upon which as soon as possible following the occurrence of the behavior that the feedback is being given to. Secondly, there's the medium. One of the problems of the technological revolution is that feedback that should be given face-to-face is too often given through email. So the medium in which a person uses feedback is important in terms of the person's acceptance or processing of the feedback. Thirdly is ambiguity, specific feedback, being clear, particularly if we're trying to drive down uncertainty. Give one point at a time and clarify it. Fourthly is the sign of the feedback, whether it's positive or negative. We should not, as leaders, shy away from negative feedback. It's common that we don't want to be negative or critical with our employees, but negative feedback is important and helpful and drives down uncertainty when used correctly. The source of the feedback message in the leadership model, of course, is the leader. The source has several dimensions to it. One is, what is the motive of the leader? Is it for the benefit of the person giving the feedback or for the benefit of the person receiving the feedback? And this matters as it's perceived by the recipient. The credibility of the source. How much does the recipient believe that the source is accurate or has the expertise to provide the feedback they're given? Thirdly is the efficacy. Is the person competent to give feedback? Do they have the ability to know and understand what the recipient needs to know? And fourthly, the power base. One of the critical problems with feedback, as helpful as feedback is in organizational dynamics, one of the critical problems with feedback is positional power. That when feedback to drive down uncertainty is given by the boss, there are certain dynamics that. So we have the recipient receiving a message from a source. For uncertainty, the recipient is going to do three things. They're going to perceive the feedback. They're going to accept or reject the feedback. And then they're going to respond. They're going to act on it or not act on it in some way. There's an awful lot that we know about the quality of the message and the characteristics of the source in terms of how they affect it. But what a leader wants from their followers when they give them feedback is for them to perceive it accurately, for them to accept it and take it in, and to respond in a positive way. Now, one helpful thing about feedback, too, is you can do this in reverse. Maybe we can go now to. For instance, a helpful aspect of feedback to drive uncertainty down is where the follower has an opportunity to give the leader feedback. So when a leader sets up an environment which feedback can go both directions, this too helps to increase voice, and it helps to instill in the followers a sense of caring, of listening, of respect from the leader, because they're willing to receive the messages that the follower has for the leader. One last thing we need to understand about feedback is the characteristics of the recipient will affect how they perceive, accept, and respond. Again, this is a big area, but just for instance, some characteristics of the recipient, such as self-esteem or tenure, will affect how open to feedback individuals are. For instance, people who've been around a long time are less open to feedback than those who have not been. Those who have a high need for achievement actually want feedback and actually like negative feedback because it will help them be a better achiever. In contrast, those who have high social anxiety have a real problem with negative feedback and would not respond very positively to negative feedback. Well, now that we see the model, let's look at some practical guidelines for feedback, and we'll just run through these briefly. First, create a norm of feedback. In other words, create an accepted and expected practice of giving and receiving feedback one to another. When you're going to give feedback, receive permission from the individual to give feedback. The person who's sending the feedback should simply describe the behavior, positive or negative outcome, and do not attack the person. The focus should be on the behavior and what is the outcome that the sender perceives is happening because of this person's behavior. This is a way to kind of get rid of the bad breath syndrome. In other words, help us to understand things about ourselves that we can't see or experience, can only know by what others can tell us. The recipient should clarify the message. Do not defend the behavior. Don't say this is what I intended or that's not what I intended. Make sure that the recipient's role is to make sure they understand exactly what the behavior is and what is the outcome of the behavior from the perspective of the sender. The recipient then owns the feedback and can respond however he or she desires. The sender should have no expectation of response. In other words, this is for instruction and motivation purposes only. It's not an evaluation process. It's not the performance appraisal process. It should occur regularly, often, and in both directions.